Have you noticed that people these days are beginning to sound more fake? They blather platitudes they hear off the news. They're beginning to sound like Patrick Bateman.
Come on, Bryce. There are a lot more important problems than Sri Lanka to worry about.
Like what?
Well, we have to end apartheid for one, and slow down the nuclear arms race, stop terrorism, and world hunger. We have to provide food and shelter for the homeless, and oppose racial discrimination and promote civil rights, while also promoting equal rights for women. We have to encourage a return to traditional moral values. Most importantly, we have to promote general social concern, and less materialism in young people.
Now what is happening here is Mr. Bateman is saying a set of words that he knows everybody is going to like, because he is a psychopath and he understands that words have no meaning. They're just tools in order to get yourself an advantage in whatever social situation you are in. So he is happy to say whatever platitudes, whatever politically correct jargon or mumbo jumbo is necessary in order to win the adoration of the crowd around him. Now, if you would like to gain power in this terrestrial world of ours, you should definitely do the same. You should figure out whatever platitudes people enjoy hearing and just shove them down their throats. But of course, George Orwell said that there's a problem if you do this. There's always a compromise. There's always a consequence to any type of actions we take. It's such a pity the way the world works this way. Because if you're going to decide to say these platitudes, if you're going to participate in this nonsense of saying fake words, if you're going to act politically correct, you're going to sterilize the language that we all share, which is going to lead to the destruction of our language, which will lead to the crumbling of the fabric of our civilization. Now, that's a pretty big claim. That's something else now, George, to be saying something like this. But George really meant this. So George Orwell wrote an essay on this called Politics in the English Language, which I think is a work of genius. Now, the reason why I call this essay a work of genius is because in Orwell's attempt to expose the sterile, insincere, politically correct style of language, he has to sit down and teach you how to use language correctly on first principles. And this is life-changing if you actually learn it properly. Oh yeah, man. So the fundamental purpose of language, in its purest sense, is for me to try create a mental picture inside of your brain by using mouth noises that travel across the air and go into your ears and are processed into pictures and imagery. My goal with my mouth noises is I want to use them to spark your imagination, to tingle your emotions, to ignite the dreams inside of your head so I can show you what I see, so I can show you in your head my reality and the things that I see outside of my eyes. That's truly what communication is trying to do. And you'll notice that all the best speakers are very, very good at doing this. They will not spend all their time blathering on about big words or jargon or abstractions or platitudes. They will not try to make themselves sound pretentious and smart. You'll notice that the absolute best speakers are always people who are very good at using visual analogies, bringing things down into simple language, but that sparks a very sophisticated and complicated image inside of your head. Now, Mr. George Orwell himself is a brilliant example of this skill. He is fantastic at showing you what he means instead of explaining to you with abstract jargon and platitudes. Does he sit around all the time talking about totalitarianism and trying to blather and smash on your head this big concept? No. He sits down and he writes 1984 and he paints inside of your imagination this vivid, sense-based experience of what totalitarianism is actually like, and it's horrific. He is able to suck you into the matrix of his thoughts and show you a nightmare. All of a sudden you understand what he means and why he's so worried about this phenomenon that he's warning about. Or what about his ability to take Animal Farm and talk about something that's kind of abstract for us in the West, such as a communist takeover, and understand the subtleties and the psychologies of how something like this will happen. And he doesn't sit there and talk in this realm of political theory. Instead, he paints a picture of a load of animals in a farm acting like absolute gombeans, and then having the fat pigs go and take over and exploit the stupidity of the farm animals. This is brilliant. This is exactly what we're talking about. He is showing you, he's igniting in your imagination images that do all the work for him, and this sticks with you. And this is redemptive for a culture as well. This is what gives our lives meaning and context. This is one of the most inspiring things about being human, is the ability to have our imagination sparked. This is why we love art so much. This is why we love movies and stuff like this, because these things stimulate our imaginations and give us an ability to feel connected with the world. It's incredibly important. The place that high quality language like this should have is the apex of a culture. It is one of the most important things that we have. Now, this is why political correctness is so goddamn evil. Now, what Orwell points out is that political correctness is a Faustian bargain that distorts the way language is used in a very sophisticated and interesting way. You see, we understand that the goal with language is we want to change your emotional state. We want to paint a picture inside of your head. Or, if you think about it in terms of politics, we want to get you to take simple actions. In politics, you don't really need people to do crazy complicated things. I might want you to go out and vote, or I might want you to hassle my enemies and love me, but it's not too much more complicated than that. I don't really want to get you to understand the mythical realities of religion or something like this. I don't want to paint a big picture in your head. I just want you to feel strong emotions and simple ones. So, what I will learn if I study man over a long period of time through this ordeal of civilization is I'll learn that people, and especially the mob, the simple mob, will have trigger words in any culture that they react strongly to. They're taboos. They're big ideas. You go back to the ancient Christian world in the medieval times, and if you walked around and you called somebody satanic, you could possibly get them killed. That word satanic, or you could call them demonic, or sinner. These words are all charged with incredibly large amounts of negative energy. And if you can successfully paint somebody as demonic, it doesn't even mean it's true. It doesn't have to have truth underneath it. Once you get that word pegged on them, the entire community might go and drag them up and tie them to a stick and burn them till their skin is bubbling and they're screaming like a demon. And what's interesting is that when you see this, you realize that these words are very useful. If you are sophisticated and intelligent and a little bit Machiavelli, you might realize that it doesn't really have to be true. This person doesn't have to actually be a demon or a Satan worshipper for you to be able to get these words and get the desired result, which would be have your enemies burned at the stake. And so what man has learned politically is to use these words even though they don't mean anything strictly. In fact, try to stop them meaning anything. As long as they get the emotional reaction you want, they don't even have to create a picture inside somebody's head. In fact, there's lots of different uses for this. For example, George talks about this. If somebody shows up in your political opposition, call them a fascist. You know, just call. Everybody knows fascism is bad. This is the prejudice of Western culture. This is our taboo. Everything is bad. You tie your shoelaces together, a fascist did it. You wake up and your alarm is late, a fascist changed your alarm. Fascism is the worst thing ever, of course. It's the giant taboo of our culture. It's the fundamental meaning Satanism demon. And if you can just throw that at anything, you can get rid of those people. And of course, if you do something good, it's democratic, because democracy is angelic. It is the kingdom of heaven. It is what Jesus wanted for this world. So if you wake up in the morning and someone says, well, what's your intention for the day today? It's like, you know what, I'm going to be very democratic with this day today. I'm a very democratic man, actually, you know. That's actually just the way I do things. You know, I'm just generally like quite democratic overall. You could call me Mr. Democracy if you want, something like that. And this is obviously going to frame you as good, and people will be like, what a great guy, what a fantastic person. Everybody loves democracy, so everybody loves this guy. Now, this is the simple one that we all know and we see all the time, the platitudes, the Patrick Bateman approach to this. But there's an even more sophisticated and interesting approach to language, which is when you don't want to evoke a mental image at all. Now, let's say for the sake of argument that I am Joseph Stalin and you're one of my cronies, and we are the rulers of communist Russia, and we have a bit of a problem. We've got people who don't like our regime. Now, what we need to do is get rid of these guys, but we can't really tell people what we're actually going to do, because what we're actually going to do is we're going to go into the middle of the night into his apartment. We're going to rip him out of bed while he's in his pajamas, give his wife a bit of a beating. He'll be there in his nightcap and we'll pull that off and throw it in the bin on the floor. We'll drag him out to a train and we'll stick him into this train and send him up to Siberia. And then we'll get him to dig the floor with his hands until they go cold and frostbitten and start bleeding. And then we'll shoot him in the back of the head. Now, of course, we can't tell the people that this is what we're doing to our opposition, so we'll call this some nice piece of jargon, something that evokes no mental imagery at all, that doesn't paint that picture. We'll find something that sounds so ambivalent, so vague, that people don't even realize that there's anything underneath it. We might say something like, well, we're going to pacify our opposition. Now, what pacification actually means is that we're putting bullets in people. We're ripping families apart. We're making people's lives terrible. But that doesn't matter, because all it means to most people is complicated word that I don't really understand what it means. It is sterile language. But that's very useful for me as the ruler, as Mr. Stalin, who owns this regime. Now, there is a downstream effect of this that is not as Machiavellian as motivation, but just as serious. And this is the fear of painting a picture inside of somebody else's imagination. So let's take Stalin once again. Me, Stalin, and all my cronies, we're just after deciding to send all these people to the gulag. And you're my counselor. You walk in and you're carrying, I don't know, my dinner. Maybe you're my chef or something. And I turn around to you, me as Stalin, I'm all chuffed at myself from doing a good job, and I say to you, it's like, hey, Mr. Counselor, what do you think of my physique? Aren't I so powerful and great? Tell me how I look today. Do I look great, making all these big decisions? Now, of course, I'm Stalin, so I've been busy, organising labor camps and stuff like this. I've kind of let myself go a bit. I've got man boobs. I've been eating too much cake and stuff like this, so I look like a bit of a tub. Now, you walking in holding, I don't know, the more cake or something like this. Your hands are shaking a bit now. You're looking at Stalin, you're thinking to yourself, I can't tell this motherfucker what I actually think. I can't turn around and say, Stalin, you look like a beached whale. Stalin, you look like a blubber seal. You can't do that, because Stalin will grab you and he'll belly flop you. He'll take you and he'll send you to the next train and you'll be in the gulag tomorrow. You can't say to him that he looks like he's more round than he is tall. So you have to say something like, Stalin, your physique looks very symmetrical. Your physique looks very full. Your physique looks very, it looks like you've gathered towards yourself a great gravity of presence. You will say stuff like this. You will use complicated, pretentious wording and fake, sterile, lifeless words that sound nice, that sound sophisticated, that sound sincere, that don't actually mean anything, that are lifeless, that are empty, because you are afraid. And of course we understand why people would do this in this type of situation, but it has this downstream consequence of sterilizing language. And what you get when you live in a culture that generally does this, maybe they do it out of immense fear of some totalitarian government, or maybe it's because they're just pussies. They're just afraid of actually being sincere and real with people, because that's definitely a possibility as well. You get a culture that gradually becomes more and more lifeless. It loses that vivid, imagistic power inside of its language and becomes more abstract, becomes more blatherbraining, and becomes more complicated. And one of the best ways you can see this is by an example that George Carlin gives.
I don't like words that hide the truth. I don't like words that conceal reality. I don't like euphemisms or euphemistic language. And American English is loaded with euphemisms because Americans have a lot of trouble dealing with reality. Americans have trouble facing the truth. So they invent a kind of a soft language to protect themselves from it. And it gets worse with every generation. For some reason, it just keeps getting worse. I'll give you an example of that. There's a condition in combat. Most people know about it. It's when a fighting person's nervous system has been stressed to its absolute peak and maximum, can't take any more input. The nervous system has either snapped or is about to snap. In the First World War, that condition was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language. 2 syllables. Shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was 70 years ago. Then a whole generation went by, and the Second World War came along, and the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. Then we had the war in Korea, 1950. Madison Avenue was riding high by that time, and the very same combat condition was called operational exhaustion. Hey, we're up to 8 syllables now. And the humanity has been squeezed completely out of the phrase. It's totally sterile now. Operational exhaustion. Sounds like something that might happen to your car. Then, of course, came the war in Vietnam, which has only been over for about 16 or 17 years. And thanks to the lies and deceit surrounding that war, I guess it's no surprise that the very same condition was called post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen. And the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet you if we'd have still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have gotten the attention they needed at the time. I'll bet you that. I'll bet you that.
Now, this is a brilliant example by Mr. Carlin, and you see that our modern world is full of this. Euphemisms, sterilized, vague jargon that sucks the life out of our reality. There's very serious consequences for this because it kills our souls. It stops our world being ignited with the vivid imagery like we have when we are children and makes this flat, grey adult existence that we live within. And of course, you see this even more in our institutions, in our political spheres, in our offices, in our colleges, because in these spheres, the petty human emotions have serious consequence. People are very worried about losing their jobs by saying the wrong thing. They're very worried about offending the wrong person. They're very worried about, tripping over somebody's toes. There's an awful lot of petty fear and Machiavelli lying going along in these games. People are trying to show off that they're smart. They're trying to gain status and jostle for position and all this. So you'll often go into like an institution like the universities and come across absolute junkheads. People who for some reason are have some type of status, but they don't have any brain. They just repeat platitudes ad infinitum. George Orwell gives a hypothetical example of this when he talks about an English professor, because he met many of these who have a fancy for Russian communism. And the problem with this, of course, as I described, is that if you want to be a Russian communist, you're going to have to accept that you're going to send people to gulags, and that's kind of positively evil in a moral frame where you think that, you're trying to save the world with this Marxist revolution. And George goes on to psychoanalyze this guy. He says, well, listen, this English professor, he can't say outright, I believe in killing off your opponents when you can get good results by doing so. So therefore, this English professor says something like, while freely conceding that the Soviet regime exhibits certain features which the humanitarian may be inclined to deplore, we must, I think, agree that a certain curtailment of the right to political opposition is an unavoidable concomitant of transitional periods, and that the rigors which the Russian people have been called upon to undergo have been amply justified in the sphere of concrete achievement. Wow. What a very interesting way of saying, I want to see people bleed. I want to see people's hands with frostbite as they scream from their emancipated, starving bodies. Yeah, that's what's really going on. This style of communication gives me a bad taste in my mouth. I get the heebie-jeebies, as if somebody's trying to sneak up behind me and shove a dildo in my ear. They're a swindler running up behind me or something like this. But of course, Orwell gives an example of good writing and good communication. And of course it comes down to these principles. You have to want to communicate. There has to be the psychological desire, the intention to reach somebody else's mind. But when you learn what that is, when you find that intention and you accept that you actually want to show people what you think, because most people are either afraid or too evil to want to do that, you realize that the style of language you need to use is not going to be all these big pretentious words. That's the midwit's way of talking. The midwit hides his lack of knowledge behind a barrage of jargon because they don't actually know what they're saying. So what they intend to do is to try hide their lack of knowledge behind something that sounds nice. It's like a really bad book with a really good cover. And the cover isn't even that good. It's like a postmodern cover or something like this. Whereas Orwell gives an example from the Bible. Because what is the Bible's goal? The Bible's goal is not to bewilder you with vagueness. Instead, the Bible wants to spark your imagination and own your imagination. It wants to penetrate deep into your very soul and paint pictures that echo for all of time, right to the moment of your death. He wants your imagination to be filled with the images and dreams within the Bible. And what's interesting is if you look at the Bible, the most successful piece of literature that has ever existed, it is all very simple language. Here's an example that Orwell points out from Ecclesiastes. It goes, "I returned and saw under the sun that the race does not go to the swift, the battle does not go to the strong, neither yet the bread to the wise, nor yet the riches to men of understanding, nor yet favour to men of skill, but time and chance happens to them all." Now, this is so straightforward. Compare this to a modern English version of this. Objective considerations of contemporary phenomenon compel the conclusion that success or failure in competitive activities exhibits no tendency to be consummate with an innate capacity, but that the considerable element of the unpredictable must invariably be taken into account. Now, they're in some sense saying the same thing. They're very close approximations of each other. But listen to the difference, the quality in the language in each. The first one, the Bible verse, is all single syllables. It's blah, 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 blah. It's very, very straightforward. There's loads of simple imagistic words. There's lots of nouns that you can visualize. A race, swift, speed, a battle, strong, bread, wise, riches, men of understanding, men of skill, under the sun. These are all very clear images. You can imagine all these inside of your mind. How do you imagine considerations, contemporary phenomenon, competitive activities, tendency, consummate, innate capacity, considerable element, unpredictable, these are all big wordism that communicates no mental imagery, because somebody who wants to communicate doesn't need big words. They need clear imagery. They need to be able to viscerally paint a picture in the person's head. That's the intention of language. People think that the words are the purpose of language because that's what they see. That's the least sophisticated way you could possibly think. The purpose of language is the effect that it has on the other person's mind. You understand that, and you understand everything. And all of a sudden, how you use language changes completely. Your goal becomes to spark their imagination, and you have to ask yourself, how do you do that? And of course, the simpler language is often the better as a consequence. The language that most clearly paints a picture is the language that wins. Yes, you can use big words. They have their place. You can sound sophisticated, sure. But as long as the goal, the reason why you're talking, is to spark that imagination, you will usually get everything else right. Now, the most important thing is to understand how all this relates to power. Because yes, you can sterilize your language and turn yourself into Stalin by gaining power by lying to people. You can go into your university or your corporate office job and, sterilize your language so that you can jostle your way up into a more prestigious position and hold yourself in high account in your head, or maybe make a bit more money. That is true. These are viable paths to more power. But of course, learning to speak correctly with clarity will also bring you immense amounts of power. One of the richest people in the world is J.K. Rowling. She's a fantastic, clear, visceral writer. George Orwell did very well for himself, and he's very prestigiously remembered by all of us. Never mind writers and poets. These people have huge positive effects on culture and often end up very, very wealthy. But even people in more pragmatic jobs like sales guys, like marketers, like people in the office or the corporation, or lecturers and stuff like this, anybody who's doing communication, they are going to win if they focus on making their language more down to earth and clear. Jordan Peterson took over the internet in his heyday because of the way that he articulated himself was very relatable for a lot of people. He wasn't a pretentious, blatherbraining Hegelian. He was actually very straightforward and spoke in a down-to-earth way with lots of visual images and analogies as a consequence. I know lots of sales guys. I've worked as a sales guy myself, and you'll always notice that the people who are able to empathize best with people and paint the best pictures that articulate what the person is looking for will be the people who end up doing the best over the long term. It's a skill question that leads to them making insane amounts of wealth. This is a very powerful path to go down, and it comes down from your ability to storytell. Now, that's an interesting thing. You can learn to storytell properly, to articulate yourself properly, to use language properly, and become powerful in a completely angelic and good way. and become very successful in the consequence, and also contribute towards reviving your culture, making your culture stronger and better and more sincere and more real, filling it up with more vibrant images and ideals, and paving the way for a positive future instead of one that is ruled by Stalins, Karens, and people with blue hair. Thank you very much for listening, and stay juiced.